Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to have all of you here in our fourth edition of the International School on Development Change. Since the foundation of this institute, we are thinking about economics and teaching economics not an end in itself, but as a way to try to change the reality of Brazil and Latin America. And I think that this initiative, it's a kind of continuation, or we are trying to maintain this tradition. So it's very important to have a lot of students from all the world here, and also professors from several countries, but especially in this year, we have a lot of colleagues from Latin America that will have opportunity to discuss one vision about development and about the challenge that it's related with a lot of changes in the contemporary capitalism. That is very important. And so I would like to first of all thank for you to be here. And also I would like to say that it will be very important to have this discussion about a lot of these challenges. For example, we know that we are passing through a lot of changes in the international relation in terms of productive and technological changes. The global value chains are changing very fast. We have this kind of global companies that are trying to control the knowledge of this, not only the control of knowledge, but also the intangible assets. We also have a risk that the adoption and the incorporation of new technologies could result in a more heterogeneity in jobs and wages. And finally, also, we have this discussion about the environmental challenges. It's important here to discuss how to face the challenges of the climate change and ensure that peripheral countries can take advantage of windows of opportunity to promote socially and environmentally sustainable development. So I would like to say again that this special edition will have opportunity to share and also learn with all of you. And finally, I would like to thank for all the people that support us in the organization of the school. First, to all the professors, my colleagues here that have participated in the organizing committee. I know that there are a lot of work that they have to do to have this event to happen. I would like also to thank to the professors from another university that kindly accepted to take part in this discussion, and also to the international office, Unicamp, that always that we ask for support. Has been giving this support for us. And finally, for the Ministry of Education, CAPES, that also have given financial support for this. So I would like to all of you to enjoy the discussion. So I would like to pass the floor to Rafael to say some words.
Thank you, Célio. Good afternoon, all. Welcome to Campinas. Welcome to Unicamp. hopefully you have very productive, interesting agenda. I'm sure observe it, see the program. So really happy to be here and to be able to welcome you all to these activities. To be here is, I understand, something very, very relevant. This time we live in. The world changes rapidly. We face now several changes and threats of different kinds. So institutions and democracy in Brazil and elsewhere are threatened. The environment is crazy, beyond repair maybe. Industry and labor present new challenges. Technology poses new threats, new risks. So I'm naming here a few challenges that are, of course, global, but and some of them, to at least some extent, may be addressed globally. But they also require a local solution. So this connection between global shared challenges, local solutions, is something that must be dealt with this kind of meeting, I assume. This is a privileged space for sharing ideas, exchanging thoughts, exchanging experiences from different backgrounds, from different lenses. So this kind of meeting is something that we are very fond of supporting, and it's something that we are enthusiastic to share. And it is also important that it is held in this school, the School of Economics, the University of Campinas. The University of Campinas is nearly 60 years old, so it's sort of a young university by most standards, but it's from the beginning a university that was designed to address real challenges for the real world. And I think that's an important statement, since academia around the globe tends to lock itself in its own ideas and thoughts. But we must not forget that what we develop here in terms of knowledge and policy recommendations, policy strategies, it's something that we all must look more upon. So to think about these problems that we share today, these challenges that our world shares today, under this peculiar trajectory of the University of Campinas, which is to always think about real world problems and to address them, and having this done so strongly over the years by the School of Economics, an important center of reference for economic thought in Brazil and Latin America. So I think it's very relevant. So we're still picking up speed after the pandemic. We have some rough years, as you are well aware of. So it's really good to see so many people here sharing this room. I see we have people watching from other places as well, but it's good to connect and to have you all here and to share this opportunity to think about the shared challenges, hopefully come to good ideas to address them. So on behalf of the university, I welcome you all, and I thank the head of the School of Economics, in which I extend the thanks to all the professors, staff, and students of this institute in promoting this opportunity for getting together and addressing these important issues. Thank you, Célia. Thank you all.
Rafael, so I would like to invite our first lecturer, so Rochon. We will talk about the crises in economic theory. So this is the idea here, to have the discussion after your lecture.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Director, Mr. Chair. And I want to thank three of my colleagues, also Simone, Carrol, for this invitation. It's interesting to see new faces, some older faces like that last week and Rio last week, and the week before. It's nice to see old faces here. My name is Louis-Philippe Rochon, for those who don't know me. I am currently a professor at Wren University. I am currently the editor-in-chief of the Review of Political Economy, of which Simone is associate editor. Rome was founded in 1989 and is enjoying its 35th year. I created some 11 years ago Review of Keynesian Economics, which is going strong, a very strong, very good journal. I'm the consulting editor of Advances in Economics Education, a new Elgar journal dedicated to teaching and pedagogy. For those who are interested in that, I am co-director of the Monetary Policy Institute. So for those who don't know, we do a lot of research with central banking and monetary policy and inflation. And we've been very busy this past year in particular. I'm the co-editor of the Elgar series on central banking and monetary policy. And what this is a series of so this is not changing, right? This is not changing. Okay, so I'll know that's fine, as long as I know, look at it. So this is a book series published by Elgar. Right now we have about 7 or 8 books. There's about 5 or 6 coming out in the coming year. And the books are all meant to push the boundaries in thinking about central banks as institutions, but also monetary policy. And so this was the first book we published, and we looked at monetary policy and income distribution, and the environment, and democratic values, social democracy. This one is coming out on monetary policy implementation. This one is coming out next year. We have another one on monetary policy and financial instability. No, that's that one. And financialization. The one on gender is coming out, and this one also came out. So it's all about thinking, rethinking, and questioning the existing model of central banking, and then just trying to develop a heterodox or post-Keynesian research agenda on these topics. And this one was a very difficult one to do because there's not a lot of research being done on gender and monetary policy. So once it's out, I'll be very happy, and I hope it will contribute to more research. I added the monetary blog, which is a weekly blog critical of monetary policy around the world. And then finally, I want to say, for those who were at the school last week, I kept telling them that you have to distance yourself from Keynes, and yet it didn't stop me from quoting Keynes probably 100 times last week, and of course, of naming my dog John Maynard Canines. Of course, friends call it Maynard. And so I told the students last week that they should leave the school with the conclusion that I'm a huge hypocrite and I don't do what I preach. Okay. Okay, so today I want to talk about the third crisis in economic theory. That's sort of a tip of my hat to John Robinson, who published in 1972 her talk called The Second Crisis in Economic Theory, which she presented at the American Economic Association lecture in 1971 at the invitation of John Kenneth Galbraith, who was then president of the EA. But in between that, I want to say that it's important topic, especially for today, given the current crisis that we're living through. But, financial crises used to be very sort of non-existent. The first recorded crisis was in 33 after Christ, under the Roman Emperor Tiberius, and the result of a credit crunch. And after that, there were no recorded crises for 600, 700 years, 800 years, 1,000 years. There was a handful. They were every 600, 700 years. But starting in the 18th century, they became more frequent. They were every 3 decades or so, and then every decade. And then in the 20th century, several crises per decade. Except during the Keynesian golden years of 1940s, 50s, and 60s, by the way. But what this means is that capitalism has sort of emerged or developed, morphed into a system of crises. And this is an argument, by the way, from Robert Goodman, who was here last year and comes here on a regular basis. And this is Goodman's argument that simply we go from one crisis to another. And this is largely the result of the crisis in economic theory. Because, the economic policies have a double-edged sword. On the one hand, they are inspired by the theory on which they are grounded. And so bad policies can lead to, we know that the central bank or the Fed increase in interest rates devalued the value of assets of some banks, led to the SVB financial crisis, other small banks. One went bankrupt last week. This was the result of bad policies, misinformed policies built on bad theories. Right? There's a debate right now with Olivier Blanchard, which the man still has a money multiplier model. And he's making all these policy prescriptions based on bad theories. So whereas policies can lead to crises, they are also supposed to solve crises. And then if these policies meant to solve crises are themselves built on bad theory, then mainstream has absolutely nothing to contribute to the solution to crisis. And we know that during the financial crisis, the mainstream solution was austerity. Fiscal austerity was practiced because it was argued that fiscal policy led to high debt ratios. Remember the Rogoff and Reagan paper that was debunked? Nevertheless, and then it was supposed to lead to inflation, it was supposed fiscal policy, inflation, crowding out effects, all of that. So we have to have some sort of fiscal consolidation, austerity measures, and then lead the entire policy sphere to monetary policy. That was what the theory told us. Now the mainstream, interestingly enough, remember the debate the Queen of England started 2009 when she asked a bunch of British economists, why did you not see this crisis coming? And their response was essentially, because our models prevent us from even thinking about a crisis. The mainstream model, is about convergence and stability. The whole system is built around the idea that you can never have a crisis. Market fundamentals all ensure that the system converges to a stable equilibrium. And therefore, they explain crises through shocks and black swans. But black swans are simply a way of saying, we're washing our hands of our bad policies. They were not the result of our bad policies. Then Bernanke, Blanchard, and others said, no, the theory is sound. And when the theory is sound, obviously the policies are sound. And so for them it was a black swan. The same thing with COVID. Google COVID black swans, we have 1 million pages. But for post-Keynesians who live in the real world and consider the world as being complex, we would argue that no, of course. The financial crisis was the result of, I'm simplifying here, of deregulation, especially of the banking system, which led to subprime, which led to an increased fragility of the system, which eventually led to its collapse. COVID is a result of environmental exploitation, and sure enough, when you play around with Mother Nature, she's going to end up kicking you back. And so these are the result of policies. In Brazil, you know all about the exploitation of your forests. And so, so that's a double-edged sword of policies. And so, you know, I always think of models with shocks. It's simply a way of diminishing the importance of the real world. That these models exclude variables that would otherwise be very explanatory. Joan Robinson said, it is perhaps more important what you leave out of your models than what you put in. What you put in, you can always exclude, statistically, economically. But if you don't put these there, important variables, God knows what else, expectations, uncertainties. You don't have a way of statistically rendering them insignificant. So when there's a crisis in theory, there's an inevitable crisis in policy. And this was, you know, Joan Robinson's, oh man. Okay. So in 1971, in December, can you believe they used to have the American Economic Association annual meeting December 28th? But she gave her talk on the second crisis, and for her, the first crisis was the Great Depression. Was the pre-Keynesian theories of, for example, Marshall, those to explain the Great Depression. It was their reliance of Say's law, their inability to consider aggregate demand or effective demand. Hence why Keynes' contribution was so important for commensals. And so, nevertheless, the Great Depression was more or less solved through Keynesian-inspired policies. The crisis was a simple one. It was a crisis in aggregate demand. And so aggregate demand policies were sufficient up to a degree of solving depression-related problems. And so that led to, you know, the 40s and the 50s and the 60s of relatively stable growth, low unemployment, low inflation. So for those decades, the golden years, these Keynesian-inspired theories, right, what Joan Robinson called bastard Keynesianism, pre-Keynesian policies after Keynes. It was sufficient to bring output back to close to full employment, and to break out of the cocoon of equilibrium, as she said. And so I want to emphasize that, the Great Depression was relatively a simple crisis in the sense that it was a crisis of unemployment, of aggregate demand, and it was more or less resolved through Keynesian-inspired policy, which showed a very powerful role of fiscal policy in reducing unemployment and enhancing economic growth. Full employment became an acceptable proposition. Good. Okay. Now, yet, despite the fact that the crisis, the depression crisis, was largely solved, the theoretical crisis was never solved. And this was Joan Robinson's critique that Keynesian-inspired policies after Keynes had nothing to do with Keynes. It was bastard Keynesianism. The revolution was abruptly canceled. And so she called it the new orthodoxy, neoclassical synthesis, what was called bastard, etc. So because the theory was never really changed, it was challenged, but yet not replaced. It was a bastard version of Keynes and reintroduced neoclassical theory through the back door. Keynesian policies became a Keynesian policy of imperfections, rigid prices, rigid wages, etc. These imperfections led to the breakdown of the neoclassical model in the short run. And then the system needed a little bit of boosts, right? Short-run boosts. Hello again. Short-run boosts to get it closer to solution. But there were new problems, according to Robinson: resource allocation, income distribution, the culture of vested interests, the crisis of affluence. These were all new issues that started to emerge, in which case neoclassical theory had nothing to say about the affluence and income distribution. It was silent on these issues. And Robinson said that the first crisis arose from the breakdown of a theory which could not account for the level of employment. The second crisis arises from a theory that cannot account for the content of it. And so what you have is you have a theory that was not reformed. It continued in a slightly revised version, but it led to more economic problems. And despite the fact that the golden years were relatively stable, there were other problems like the capture of policy by vested interests. And so that was the second crisis in economics. And it's a shame, in a way, that she spoke in 1971. Because I would have loved to have Robinson here to talk about today. Because not only is neoclassical theory still dominant, but it's accompanied, I think, with a political force. The elections of Margaret Thatcher and of Ronald Reagan, coupled with what now we call neoliberalism, starting around 1980. Sort of neoclassical economics on steroids. But the rise of neoliberal policies led to a more extreme versions of pre-Keynes theory, post-Keynes, founded on micro-foundations, rational economic manner. And this, I think, has contributed to this third crisis. Again, this third crisis is a continuation of the first and second crisis, the inability of the profession to change, to evolve. But the nature of the crisis today is far worse than the simple Keynesian problem of a depression. And this is what I said, plus ça change, as we say in French, the more things change, the more they remain the same. There was a brief flirtation in 2009 with Keynesian policies, a couple of years of crisis, nothing was changing, the system was in dire situation. So there was a moment of weakness, according to Bernanke. It was, right, the return of the master. Keynes came back, right? Return of the master is Skidelsky's book. And there was for a little moment, for 1 year, in fact, for only 1 year, the adoption of very Keynesian-inspired policies of fiscal expansion. But by 2010, at the Toronto G20 meeting, it was agreed by world leaders that fiscal austerity ought to be the new marching orders, and they reverted back to austerity measures. As J.D. Galbraith says, the moment passed. There was no return. There was no revival. There was no resurrection. And so we're setting ourselves up to this third crisis. Now, the revival of mainstream economics, not a revival per se, in the sense that it was always there, but certainly this revival of fiscal austerity and monetary policy dominance, right? The idea that only monetary policy can have any impact whatsoever on the economy in a good way. Fiscal policy was bad. Monetary policy was good. And so monetary policy, austerity, high interest rates, or whatnot, or whatever it was, in this case it was low interest rate, was the only solution. Bernanke calls for a radical reworking of economics profession go too far. Bernanke, shortcomings in 2010, right? This is 2 years deep into the crisis. Shortcomings of what I had called economic science, in contrast, were for the most part less central to the crisis. Neoliberal policies was not the cause of the crisis. Indeed, although the great majority of economists did not foresee the near collapse of the financial system, economic analysis has proven and will continue to prove critical in understanding the crisis. Economic analysis here, he does not mean post-Keynesian. Mainstream analysis will continue to prove critical in understanding the crisis. And I don't understand that. Because it is a theory based on convergence. In developing policies to contain and in designing long-term solutions to prevent its occurrence. And for me, this makes absolutely, how can the chair of the Federal Reserve, I now know they're laureate, have this explanation of the role of economic theory, mainstream? Blanchard, the state of macro is good. Macroeconomics is going through a period of great progress and excitement. And the crisis was not triggered primarily by macroeconomic policy. In many ways, the general policy framework should remain the same. So there's this consensus that policy inspired by neoliberal economic theory has nothing to do. Right? This is black swans. See how they're washing their hands of the responsibilities of their own theory. So, for me, after the financial crisis and COVID, just like in the Depression led to some sort of change. bastard Keynesianism. But it was somewhat maybe better than pre-Keynes policies of peaking, for example. At least there was a recognition of short-run dynamics. I'll take that. But after COVID, nothing happened. In fact, the profession simply doubled down. I remember going to professional conferences in 2007 and 8, and how they were dominated by mainstream policy, mainstream papers of trying to explain what happened. By 2010, 11, it was just business as usual. These critical papers, mainstream papers, simply disappeared. I remember I was at a conference right before COVID in Atlanta, Georgia. And this was 2019, right? And so I had a paper on the financial crisis, and I was accused of still talking about it. But what happened, I think, and it started before COVID, and maybe it started with the financial crisis, there was the rise of the dissenters, what Mark called the mainstream dissenters. Those people like Stiglitz and Krugman, and a few others who were critical of mainstream economics. But I think that whereas some people see the dissenters as a sign that the mainstream is crumbling, I don't know, I see the dissenters as reinforcing the supremacy of orthodoxy. Because now the mainstream can say, oh, no, look at us. We're very open-minded. Look at these people. We allow them to criticize us. Look at how innovative we are. But if you listen to what Stiglitz and these people are saying, they're saying, we can't be too critical because Krugman says his telephone doesn't ring anymore. No one calls Krugman to ask him for his advice. They go to Lawrence Summers and others of that ilk. So the dissenters, they play a very important role for the hardcore mainstream by saying, look at us. We self-reflect. The only one that goes maybe a little bit very dissenting is Stiglitz. I think Stiglitz does go quite far in his criticism. But Stiglitz no longer has any influence. If you look at, it was just published a list of the most influential economists. And Stiglitz is down. He's still amongst the top maybe 50. But if you look at the top 10, the top 20, there are these ultra, Asimo Blue and these Rogoff and Summers, these ultra-orthodox people. And more these dissenters don't really have a role to play except to sort of give a false facade. So, nothing has changed. This is not anyone here hasn't heard before. But we still stuck with a very sort of reinforced neoclassical theory with micro foundations and rationality. So in this way, the third crisis is very much the same. It's a continuation of the first and second crisis in theory, but I think with greater complications and consequences. And because of that, the policy responses must be different than your typical sort of Keynesian fiscal policy. We have to go much beyond that. So the first two crises took place under Keynesian regimes. The third one takes place under a neoliberal regime, which is more dangerous because it was exported into a number of institutions, like the Maastricht, Washington Consensus, austerity, and they were reinforced, and now they've become, despite the fact that the IMF might have maybe appeared a little bit open, not so much anymore. Or it's one paper published by one person. The overall institution is still very much pro-neoliberal policies. And so the consequence of this regime are far more catastrophic. And it has led to not just a crisis, but a polycrisis. The third crisis in economic theory is a polycrisis. And which are, been advocated by Tooze, by Isabella Weber, and it's not just, right, Isabella calls it overlapping crises, and that's fine, but it's not just overlapping crises. It is the fact that these crises feed on each other, such that the macro consequence, the overall impact of all these crises far exceed the sum of their individuals. Low interest rates led to a credit and debt boom. Now, I'm going to have something to say about it, because I don't really believe that's the cause. Okay? But, certainly it contributed to it, fiscal austerity. Look at the crisis we have, ecological and climate change crisis. Are we beyond the tipping point? Is it too late to save the environment? Just a few days ago, the Secretary General of the UN says we are done with global warming. We are now in a period of global boiling. He said this over the weekend. Global boiling, that's the new term. And we all can provide dozens of examples of why that would be the case. So that's a huge crisis in itself. At the same time, we have an inequality crisis. Very much a la Hilferding, by the way, when he talked about these dual economies. Now, for me, I place income inequality at the very heart of the theory of effective demand. And if you look at Piketty's famous graph, where income inequality was in 1929, and then it came down after the Depression, the war, remained relatively stable, started picking up again in 1980. This is your neoliberal policies. And in 2007, it was at the same level. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that what happens is that inequality and greater inequality makes the system more fragile. And in that sense, if inequality leads to, and this is an empirical question, and I'll leave that to those who are better versed in econometrics than me, but if inequality leads to fragility of your system, and then unlike the Depression where we took measures to bring inequality down, taxes, etc. This new era, after the financial crisis, we didn't do that. And inequality today is much higher than what it was in 2007. And so when I said at the beginning that capitalism has evolved into a system of bouncing from one crisis to another, the question of when it's not a question of whether there will be another crisis. That is a certainty. The only question is what. And when your system is very, very fragile, then anything can lead to the collapse of the system. In 2007, the housing market, subprime market, that is something that contributed to finally bring the system down. What will that be in 10 years? I don't know. But the system will remain fragile. So, I believe that whereas the mainstream model is about convergence and stability, the post-Keynesian, the real world is about fragility and instability. Alan Minsky, I think Minsky in describing the system as fragile and unstable. Stable because stability implies convergence to an equilibrium position. Minsky tells us, no. Stability can breed instability. The system is prone to instability. The system is unstable and fragile. So policies can have a real impact on the fragility of the system. And everyone thought that low interest rates, the central bank keeping interest rates at zero for several years was a good policy until regional banks started going bankrupt. I don't think anyone had sort of anticipated that problem. Now, let me just say this now. I don't think that the zero interest rate policy was to blame. I don't think zero interest rate policies lead to financial bubbles. I think that what leads to financial bubbles and the SVB bank is a lack of regulations. And this was partly recognized during the SVB debate, when it was recognized that the regulatory bodies were not paying attention to these regional banks. It's the lack of regulation. Someone should have gone in there and say, look, you can't do this. And it's the same thing with asset bubbles. We have to have regulations that present X, Y, and Z behavior that lead to bubbles. No free marketer likes regulations, but regulations are the only way of containing a fragile, unstable system. And with this inequality, and Hilferding, when he talked about these two paths of development, I remember I gave a talk at Unicamp in 2010 maybe, where I talked about this, where I say there are these two economies. You have a wage economy, and a profit economy. And this was made clear to me. I have some friends who are very rich, not me, just friends. And I remember 2010 when the stock market had rebounded. I remember they were saying, what crisis? For them, there was no crisis. It was a little thing, but it rebounded. Whereas wages were depressed for still maybe rebounding a little bit now. But we'll see, certainly not enough. And if you look at financial assets, stock markets rebound much faster than the real estate market. And the real estate is what is the only asset for much of the middle class. So when there's a crisis and the stock market falls, it rebounds. COVID took a year. But real estate hasn't recovered as well. And it takes several years for real estate to recover. So the market, the asset for most of the middle class takes much longer to recover. Whereas for those in the profit economy, it rebounds quickly enough. There's a cost of living crisis. And I don't want to say only inflation. I think this past inflation was proven to be short-lived, right? Central bankers last year, they were right when they said they didn't want to raise interest rates because inflation was going to be short-lived. They were right about that. But they came to the pressure of the vested interests. But there's also a question of low wages, bad jobs, right? This is still the cost of living crisis. There's the democratic dysfunctional crisis, the rise of right-wing Bolsonaro, Trump, and others in Italy and Italy. We realize that neoliberal policies led to concentration in the fragility of our supply chains. This idea that, if we diversify production to low-income countries, everyone gains, but that wasn't the case. That proved to be a problem. The household debt crisis, right? This is Steve Keen's mantra, that this might be the source of the next financial. Not only are households, not only is the distribution of income, but part of it's very polarized, but the working class is increasingly indebted. And that might be a problem, especially with rising interest rates. The social housing crisis around the world, the food insecurity crisis around the world, the geopolitical conflicts, and the increasing capture of vested interests. Like I said, a year ago, central banks told us we're not raising interest rates. Inflation is going to, I said this last week in the classes, central bankers, policy people, they have access to the same data as we all do. And surely they know that, and they told us that inflation was from, oil, the war, and the bottlenecks. They knew that. They knew that. And they know, because they're allegedly intelligent people, and they know that monetary policy operates on demand-led inflation. Raising interest rates is not going to solve the war in Ukraine, certainly not going to solve bottlenecks issues. So why do they do it? Gerald Epstein from UMass tells us that central banks are not independent. They form policy with finance-colored glasses. Right? It's when the central banks were accused of being irresponsible. And there was a huge backlash when central banks said, we're not raising interest rates. And then inflation was going up and up. And the financial interests were saying, no, you're being irresponsible. And that's when central banks started to raise interest rates. They caved to the vested interests. Is AI a crisis in the making? Is there another virus crisis coming? So, this is sort of the picture in which we live in. It's not a simple crisis of aggregate demand anymore. Multi-overlapping crises. Some of them may actually contradict with each other. I have to give that a thought. But, well, maybe not, but all certainly the result of increased policies inspired by neoliberal thinking. Oh, Jesus. Okay. Now, there's a second dimension to this crisis. I think that with the Depression, we saw governments sort of coming together and willingly wanting to solve the problem. Okay, maybe the war did. But starting with the financial crisis, there was really no desire to solve the financial crisis. Governments reluctantly adopted Keynesian policies. In Canada, the conservative government, went kicking and screaming to adopt fiscal policy and was all too happy to abandon them a year later. But I think today, there's a general unwillingness to solve even maybe some of these crises that might be easier to solve than others. The housing crisis. Easy to solve. Build more houses, build more units. It's an easy problem to solve. But there's an unwillingness to deal with the climate crisis, unwillingness to address inequality in any serious way. So there's a general unwillingness or, unwillingness to deal with crisis, with the problem. And for me, like I said, we're not for the vested interest. Very easy to deal with a lot of these. And this is a quote by Keynes I love so much, given at a BBC interview in 1942. He says, anything we can actually do, we can afford. Sort of MMT, if you think about it. In the long run, almost anything is possible. We can do almost anything we like, given time. In good time, we can do it all. But we must work to a long-term program. And this is what he's saying. This is the willingness to sit down and try to figure out what these policies, not these short-run policies, but these long-run solutions to some of these problems. In Toronto, I don't know if you know the tent movement around the world is homeless people now are camping in tents in city parks. And in Toronto, the solution was to bring them portable toilets. They're not even talking, sure, maybe they're talking, but they're not acting on building more housing, which is the long-run solution. So, a very inspirational quote. And so this is, moving forward, we have to recognize the fragility and unstable nature of our system. And a policy crisis requires a policy solution. And not full employment. Full employment for me is short run. You have full employment this year, you may not have it next year. I welcome full employment, but I think we need to go further. We need to have a policy of full investment. And this comes from Keynes. He says this one place in the general theory, a state of full investment in the strict sense has never yet occurred, even momentarily. And Keynes doesn't describe full investment, but I interpret that to mean working not only on production and output, but on the capacity to produce and the capacity of output. Productivity enhancing policies. This is not a crisis of aggregate demand, though it is, but it's more than that. It's a crisis of public investment. And if you look at the last 30 years and the decrease in public investments, this, I think, has gone a very long way of exacerbating the problem. And even policies of fiscal austerity. Fiscal austerity and the concept of zero deficits only leads to the devaluation of public investment. It undermines public. Right? Keynes was saying you should have, a current account. Maybe you could maybe, balance that. But the capital, government capital, infrastructure, investment account should never be balanced. But in the policy frenzy of neoliberalism and zero deficits, that has happened. And that has simply undermined the importance of public investment. I think that in terms of fiscal policy, we definitely need to address income and wealth inequality. This would be for me, and it could be, we used to have marginal tax rates of 75% in the 50s and 60s. And growth per capita was much higher back then than what it is today. So this is low taxes has led to this dual economy. We need a bunch of regulation. And that goes a long way. And these regulations should be aimed at regulating Profits. The sources of profits. Monetary policy should not, I wrote a paper called The Weaponization of Inflation, where central banks have used inflation as an excuse to fight inflation on the backs of workers. Remember Lawrence Summers from his chair in the Caribbean with the palm trees in the back of the ocean, and he says, with his big cigar, there was no cigar, but I think it adds. We should have more unemployment. Governors of central banks saying we have to endure more pain. And by pain, he's not saying that rentier class should pay higher taxes. He's saying, no, you guys should get it. Right? It is the fight of inflation, and so in this sense, inflation is rooted in conflict. The whole emphasis on conflict inflation, post-Keynesian theory. So inflation is rooted in conflict, and the policies to fight inflation are rooted in conflict as well. And so I wrote another paper called The General Ineffectiveness of Monetary Policy. Monetary policy is not meant to regulate economic activity. It does that very badly and very clumsily. And that's why I called for, I wrote those papers with Mark Setterfield on park interest rate. Park monetary policy, and let's go back to fiscal policy. Fiscal policy can do a lot more than monetary policy. And so I don't think central banks, despite the fact of having edited a book on central banking, monetary policy, and the environment, I don't think central banks should be used to regulate environmental issues. I think we have to recognize that it has environmental impact and consequences, and income distributive consequences. But I think at the end of the day, we may be asking central banks to do a little bit too much. Leave central bank with their original objective of financial stability. And all the rest should really fall back under the aims and scope of fiscal policy. What do we do about international finance, the debt relief of developing countries? These are old questions, but they're all coming back. And we also have to think about credit policy. Politicians don't talk about credit policy a lot, but we should. Fiscal policy, monetary policy, credit policy. Credit is the pavement along which production travels, in which bankers knew their duty, would provide the transport facilities to just the extent, et cetera, et cetera. But not just about credit to full employment. This was the role of banks, right? Banks are special for Keynes. But banks have failed. If you look at the ratio of credit to overall assets of banks, it has gone down considerably over the last 20 years. So we're sort of less and less in monetary economy of production, more and more into casino capitalism according to Keynes. But credit is still very important. And so this opens the door of public banking. The role of BNDES. So the BNDES and I were working on a project for next year on sort of this full investment policy. What does that mean? What does it mean for Brazil? And what role can the BNDES play in adopting and fostering a true policy of full investment? Especially in terms of the green transition. Who presented this morning on green transition? I'm sure he has a lot more to say about that than me. And at the end of the day, if we are relying on public credit, we must also rely on public profits, socialization. This is what Mariana Mazzucato has been calling for a long time. Oops. Okay. So three conclusions, and I'll leave it there. All of this that I've been talking about, the poly crisis, they bring issues that are beyond economics, food insecurity. These are economic issues, but they bring forth issues that relate to sociology and maybe history. And so more than ever, what is required is pluralism of thought to solve the poly crisis. So the poly solution, I'm less interested, I am, in the solutions per se, but where do these solutions come from? If these solutions are inspired by neoliberalism, then I'm not interested. But if these solutions come from a pluralism, then I'm very interested. And this means that we have to have pluralism from within the heterodox tradition. We have to bring forth Schraffians, post-Keynesians, fundamentalists, Kaletkians, and various other ecological post-Keynesians, feminine, a gendered approach to policies as well. And we have to take the best elements from each. And we must emphasize the cross-fertilization. And this is something that I'm trying, I've got various projects now based on this. One that will be coming out is bringing together the concept, this is theoretical, but the concepts of endogenous money and Schraffian economics. So, and there are others as well. I'm trying to write a paper on the core elements of heterodox economics, which would be signed by me, a Schraffian, an institutionalist, a Kaletkian. You get the idea. But we also need pluralism. We also need to support and encourage those who are succeeding, even if we disagree. God knows I don't agree with everything that MMT says, but they've done incredible. This is what we call the post-Keynesian influencers. They have 100,000 followers on Twitter and more. And they reach a large portion of people. When my taxi driver talks to me about NFT, you got to applaud how they go. So cross-fertilization, Mariana, I did my PhD with Mariana, she's a Schumpeterian. So we have to support them. Now, pluralism also in terms of, oh no. And then pluralism amongst the social science. We need to rely on history, sociology, on politics. I published a symposium and wrote on what can economists learn from sociology. I'm publishing one next year, what can post-Keynesians learn from anthropologists? Go read anthropologists if you want to understand money. Because economists don't understand. And this is very much Keynes. The master economist must possess a rare combination of gifts. He must be mathematician, historian, statesman, philosopher. He must understand symbols and speak in words. He must contemplate the particular in terms of the general, touch abstract and concrete at the same flight of thought. He must study the present in light of the past for the purposes of the future. No part of man's nature or his institutions must be entirely outside his regard. He must be purposeful and disinterested in a simultaneous mood, as aloof and incorruptible as an artist, yet sometimes as near to earth as a politician. Alfred Eichmann, this great American economist, said, the economist has 1 foot in mathematics and 1 foot in history. And Jamie says we should open our discipline to learn some physics and geophysics and engineering and law, not in order to give post-Keynes and the heterodox a more sort of legal or scientific, but in order to understand how things work in nature. He was referring to, to the environment. Anyways, that's it. Those are my 3 conclusions. Support each other. I just got a paper for Rome that from an author who really criticizes another author. And I reached out to Professor Diaz and just said, I don't know what to do. The paper's okay, but we should support each other more. We should look for, and this, by the way, is what Engelbert Stockhammer has been working, sort of looking at similarities and confluences amongst the social scientists. And we should be more open to the Schumpeterians, the Kleckians, the Schraftians. And for me, my approach to economics, and Lavoie describes me this way in his book, says that I'm an eclectic. And usually when someone is eclectic, that means it's an insult. But he means it in a good way, where you take the best of everything. And I take some from Minsky, some from Davidson. I take some from Kiletsky, from Keynes, despite my criticism, and from John Robinson. And so I think that this is what we should do to try to find more common ground. Because at the end of the day, what Galbraith tells us is we're not going to succeed if we're divided. So we have to find common ground, and we've got to move forward in one step and not as a divided image. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, give me time to go and get my little.
So thank you, Professor Rochon, for this lecture. We have enough time for the session of the way. So I would like just to ask, for those that want to direct questions for Professor Rochon, to identify yourself before the questions. So maybe group of 3 or 4 questions.
Yes.
Thanks for the amazing lecture. I'm interested about the public investment as a policy proposal. So we have also seen like there's improvement when we introduce this new deal to deal with the Great Depression. Kind of public investments will be used in the system. Are you proposing something of a similar nature or will be
Louder. I'm old.
From US gas and agreements. And I would like if you could speak more on full investment. What are you thinking about full investment?
So both of these questions are very similar. It could be that, you know, it could, so for me, full investment, like I said, full employment, Keynes says you can dig holes and put bottles and, you know, for me, that's not enough. You know, we can think of many ways of increasing the capacity of our infrastructure, electrical grids, the greening of our economies. And, you know, the trying to break our reliance on oil. Yeah, infrastructure, and it could be something like that. I would have, you know, because that would fall very much in the realm of public housing crisis. But see, I think that by adopting a full investment, and I'll apologize to you that, you know, I don't have a full definition because Keynes doesn't provide it. And so we're left trying to figure out what that means. And with a co-author of mine, Wesley Marshall from UNAM, we wrote a paper on full investment. And we're trying to figure out what that means exactly and what would that entail in terms of policies. And I'm sure these would be very sort of country specific, but you know, anything that looks at raising the living standards of the working or the working poor through social housing, for example, there's a million things we can think of. There's a million policies. But what's important is that we have to be strategic about what we spend and how we spend it on. And I think that, you know, subsidies for technological improvements in companies, certainly a welcome thing. But then that's a double-edged sword, because what you don't want is labor disrupting technologies as well. But we just have to sit down and figure out what that exactly means. And that would be the purpose of the BNDES workshop next year. But just like that, Truman policy really was a response to the need of the system after the war, where you had those soldiers coming back and you needed to provide some sort of housing for them. And this was the willingness to do so. Today, there's absolutely no willingness to do anything about the homeless. And, you know, or about one of the crises is the immigration crisis as well. So, you know, I think it starts with the will. How do you convince governments? Well, you have to try to elect the proper government. And you guys in Brazil, you've done that with Lula. Bravo. But Brazil can't there's just so far Brazil can go on its own. So you need countries to move in step, as Keynes tells us. I quote Keynes way too much.
Right. Okay. Professor, talk more maybe about what Unicamp was meaning with the idea of a new economy. I haven't heard of that, and I'd like to know where he wrote this. And you mentioned that you have written about that already. I'd like to know more.
I never wrote about it. I gave a paper, a presentation on it. But Hilferdink wrote a book in 1910. He was a Marxist, and he talked about, Monica might know a little bit more about Hilferdink, I'm guessing, maybe. And she can certainly say something about it, but, you know, two paths of economic development. One which would be sort of a race towards the bottom, exploitation, and the other one would be a better sort of development along better job creation, better good jobs, etc. And so countries can develop according to one versus the other. For me, I talk about within one country where you have wage income and profit income. So it's inspired by Hilferding, but it's not exactly how he intended it. So that's why it's a la Hilferding. Do you have anything to, yeah.
I'm a little bit frustrated with my remarks today. So I would like to take a different lecture. I have two questions.
Okay.
One of them is concerning this kind of discussion between finding a common ground between Marxian and Keynesian economics. So if you are one of your conclusions, one of your strongest conclusions is that we have to help each other in finding this common ground, and any of us that can reach the general public in our organization should be celebrated and helped in this sense. So, but I would like to ask to you comment on that, considering two aspects. One is methodological philosophy. So, okay, we for sure have this kind of common ground when speaking on the difference between the heterodox field and the mainstream economics, but still we are a very divided community. And the other aspect is ego and psychological one. Also, I think this could be a source of problems in this call for unity.
So just to go back to Hilferding, check out the book, and he talked about, paths of development for developing countries where they would have essentially two different paths, sort of an income creation, the benefit, and then one that's kind of what I was saying, but more in terms of production and stuff. Whereas I talk about more in terms of income class.
Is it in financial capital?
Yeah. I think that post-Keynesian economics is turning 50. 2025 is the 50th anniversary of the Eichner-Kragel paper in the Journal of Economic Issues. So it's a good time to start reflecting on these things. Rope is dedicating some space to this reflection. And if I look at who was who back in 80, when they started the Trieste school, it flopped because of personalities, like you said, egos. Paul Davidson, Garignani. And so I love Paul, but I think he did a lot of harm. He did a lot of good, created a journal, first post-Keynesian journal, but I think he also did a lot of harm with this sort of sectarian, doctrinaire approach to post-Keynesian economics. And I compare Paul, for Paul, there's probably three post-Keynesians in the world. Himself, Gardim, and Roy Rothheim, maybe a few. Whereas if you look at someone like Lavoie, who spent his career building bridges with different approaches. And I think at the end of the day, I'm more comfortable with that version. I've known Lavoie for 40 years, not surprising. But then the Davidson thing, I think, and I think that we have to maybe forget the Davidsons and the Garignanis, because I think they're too doctrinaire. Paul says there will never be any common ground between Keynesians and Minskians. Yeah, Paul hated Minsky, so couldn't stand each other. So, and the Kaletkians. But I think, there's plenty of room that I can think of between Minsky and the post-Keynesians. I think that a lot of these approaches are complement They complement each other. And they're not necessarily contradictory. We might have to try to drop off the more radical aspects of Schraffians or Kalekians or, to find common ground, but I think common ground is possible. I just finished writing a paper on the similarities between post-Keynesians and Schraffians on the idea of monetary policy and income distribution. Sent it to Lavoie, and Lavoie says, wow, I never saw those similarities. So they are there. And in our paper, we kind of don't really talk about the differences. But that's fine. The Schraffians can have their more radical ideas on the side, and we can have our more radical ideas on our side. But, for example, Schraffians don't really talk about rentiers. That's post-Keynesian. They talk about the rate of profit. But, we complement each other quite well. And we found common ground. And the symposiums with Schraffians and post-Keynesian on endogenous money and supermultiplier. We're finding common grounds on this. And I think that at the end of the day, if we find enough common ground, we're going to realize, oh, look at that. We have a pretty full theory here where we have a lot of similarity. And I think that the differences might be more of a matter of emphasis than substance. But, one thing is we don't spend enough time. There's sure a lot of papers criticizing each other. There's not a lot of papers that try to say, what are the similarities between the Marxians and the post-Keynesians? That's worth exploring. But we all agree with effective demand, I think. We all agree, so there's a lot that we agree.
Your hand first.
Professor Jonas from Economia from the University of Louis-Philippe.
Yeah, louder.
Jonas from Epoch and from the University of Louis-Philippe. I wanted to ask about the crisis in economic theory recently, because I feel like after the global financial crisis, there was this debate somehow within orthodoxy of a crisis in the theory. So you have the paper by Romer on the trouble of economics, you have the whole debate of secular stagnation. And somehow it feels like now with the comeback of inflation, this has faded away. So on one hand, what's your opinion on this? Do you think now there's less opening within the orthodoxy of problems in your own theory? And then to add to this, what's the effect of the rise of China and the success of economic development for this opening up of the economic debate for heterodox traditions?
Thank you for your presentation, Professor. My name is Carrol. I would like to hear your comments on your argument that low inflation, low interest rates that generate asset bubbles is actually an unregulated market. I would like to argue against this claim that it's not actually, it's a combination of these two factors, actually an environment of unregulated markets in a situation of low interest rates. Because, I don't know, I think it's hard to argue that today with high interest rates, there will be another asset bubbles in an unregulated environment. So I would like to elaborate a little bit more.
Well, I think that the growing consensus now in post-Keynesian economics is to argue against fine-tuning. Monetary policy is inefficient, MNT is against fine-tuning, and those who follow Lavoie. So we should not be using interest rate, monetary policy, to regulate economic output. because, we reject sort of IS curve relationships, or at least very inelastic relationships. The Phillips curve is very flat now. So the idea of using interest rates to regulate economic activity, to regulate inflation, fine. So that leaves the question is, what should we do with interest rates? And this was never a problem, I think, prior to last year. We had 3 or 4 decades of low inflation. So monetary policy was not much of a debate. But there was a little debate in the sense that some of us were arguing in terms of interest rate rules. So I wrote about what I call the MMT rule, the Smith rule, and the Pazinetti rule, 3 different rules of income distribution. So for us, monetary policy is about income distribution, not about regulating economic activity. That leaves the question, okay, fine. What level of interest rate? And we sort of, the MMT rule is to have a nominal rate of interest equal to 0. The Smith rule is a real rate of interest equals to 0. And the Pazinetti rule is to have a real rate of interest equal to the growth of wages, of real wages, which means, low interest rates. And once you've established that, what can you do to prevent bubbles? Well, I think that we had periods of low interest rates in the 50s, 60s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, and we never really had huge financial bubbles. These were the result of the elimination of Glass-Steagall and other sort of deregulations, which makes me think that what you cannot disagree with is that bubbles are caused by certain types of behavior. It's the actions of individual or of corporations. And so for me, if we agree on that, and maybe you would say, the actions of corporations and individuals relative to a low interest rate. Maybe that's where you see that we agree, but he's adding a little, I would argue, well, okay, let's keep the low interest rates and let's concentrate on the behavior of agents through regulations. And, there's no reason why banks were allowed to give out subprime loans. There's no reason to believe that these rating agencies rated these subprime loans as AAA assets. So if you can tell me that bubbles and speculation have to do with low interest rates, I would say it's those banks that gave bad loans, the rating agencies, and they knew, right? They knew. So I think it's more to do with behavior. And so we regulate the behavior. There's no reason someone who makes $50,000 was able to afford an $800,000 house. And then so the real estate bubble grew, not because of low interest rates. It might have motivated some people, but at the heart of the problem, it was those banks and other institutions that allowed that bubble to be validated. Regarding, what was your question?
About the current crisis in current theory, if there's less opening of the
Oh, yeah.
now in the world time.
Yeah, after the financial crisis, Blanchard spoke about Minsky. Newspapers during the crisis talked about Minsky. But I think you're right, I think this was temporary. There was at one time some talk about incorporating into dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models crises. But I think it failed because they don't know how to. I mean, the fundamental component of those models are convergence to stability. So how do you introduce instability in these models? And that's a problem that they face. And if you introduce instability in your model, then you have to recognize that your model is no longer prone to stability. And then you're back into post-Keynesian territory. But I think you're right. I think it was this, and like I said, you go to conferences in 2008 and 9, those papers were a dime a dozen. But I think they stopped in 2010, and less so. People like Blanchard talks about conflict inflation, and having been inspired by Rowthorne. It's interesting, but his model of inflation is demand-led. It's a conflict model based on demand-led inflation. So at the end of the day, not that heterodox. But Blanchard had been talking about these models for 30 years, so it's not just something recent for him, but no one in the mainstream talks about Minsky anymore, nobody.